We turn now to the year 1963, and this is the year in which the Beatles increasingly, their success increased really beyond what anybody really could have expected. It was really pretty phenomenal that by the second half of 1963, the Beatles were the biggest thing in UK pop music. Now, it's important as we think about 1963 to realize that throughout most of 1963, nobody in the United States understood that there was this group, the Beatles, and they kind of didn't know what was coming. Next week, we'll talk about the Beatles' arrival in the U.S. in more detail in January and February of 1964, and what a great shock that was. But now this is all about the building of the Beatles' career in the UK, and in fact, their attempts to try and build it around the continent. You know, it was in many ways the U.S. was seen as a pipe dream, maybe someday, but at least we can maybe get some more sales in Germany and Sweden and places like that. And so they're touring on the continent and touring early 1964 in France, for example. So we talk about the important performances of the Beatles during 1963. They did a tour in April of 1963 with Tommy Roe. They were not at the top of the bill. In May of 1963, they did a tour with Roy Orbison. There was a lot of sort of friendship between Roy Orbison and the Beatles. Of course, Roy Orbison later ending up in the Traveling Wilburys with George Harrison. They did their first headlining tour in November of 1963. By that time, there was no point in having them not end the bill because they were so big. Their first BBC TV appearance was in April of 1963. And then there was a regular BBC radio show, which just was an excuse for playing lots of Beatles, called Pop Goes the Beatles. So they were getting some real media saturation, remembering that in the UK, media saturation means something entirely different than it would have meant in the US because the differences in the way radio, television, and things are configured. Very difficult to hear a lot of popular music on the radio. There was pirate radio, of course, but otherwise everything sort of came to people through the BBC. That's why a place like Brian Epstein's NEMS Music was such a fantastic center and a resource in Liverpool for the Beatles, because Brian had everything in that record store, and he had listening booths, and they would hang out there for hours listening to records they couldn't afford to buy. That's what you did instead of having the radio available to you, or like we have today, being able to sort of dial the tune up on the internet or something. So the Beatles back in 1963 getting some real media exposure. Probably the most important performances for them in 1963 were performance on Sunday night at the London Palladium. That was October of 1963. That was kind of the big Sunday night variety show. And again, emphasis on variety show. Not a rock music show, but a show in which all kinds of different acts appear. And the Beatles were sort of something for the kids, something for the teenagers kind of thing. But it was a real mark of arrival. And a few weeks later, they did a Royal Command performance in November of 1963. This is the performance where John scared the dickens out of Brian Epstein by telling him he was going to make an announcement, and Brian would just have to wait and see what it was. And of course, given the kinds of things John Lennon was capable of saying, who knows, according to Brian Epstein, what might have come out of his mouth. But what he ended up saying, the beginning of Twist and Shout, is, this song is a little bit loud. We'd like to ask for your help or participation. I'm paraphrasing here. He says, for those of you in the cheaper seats, clap your hands. The rest of you, referring to the royalty and aristocracy, just rattle your jewelry. And it was just cheeky enough that it was funny without being offensive. And that was the line that John Lennon liked to play on, you know. Most of the time, he stayed away from the offensive end. Although in 1966, when the whole thing about the Beatles and being bigger than Jesus and stuff blew up, it's clear he'd crossed a certain kind of line, even if he didn't intend to do. But this is an early instance of that. Anyway, the Beatles, the darlings of the UK musical world, that by the end of 1963, they would go on in early 1964 to play the Ed Sullivan Show, February the 9th, 1964 for the first time. But that's a story for next week. What changes did all of this make in the UK pop scene? Well, before the beat music boom, of which the Beatles were the first, but by no means not the only. I mean, like happens in the music business, once the Beatles start to have hits, everybody's got to have a group just like them because they want to have those hits too. And so all of a sudden there's a flood of groups doing what was referred to as beat music. In fact, you know, London agents and record company people who never would have gone to Liverpool or Manchester or Birmingham or places like that to look for groups, all of a sudden were convinced that there was some kind of a northern sound. So they were all going up there, trying to find as many groups to sign as they could. And this success, before this beat music boom, UK artists were viewed themselves and by their fans as really being second-rate compared to American artists. I mean, one of the reasons why these UK artists were able to get the gigs in Hamburg is because the Hamburg clubs could never have afforded to hire the actual Americans. And when they did come, like Little Richard, where the Beatles sort of opened for Little Richard at one point at the Star Club, I mean, it was a big deal. And by that time, Little Richard was not the draw he had been years earlier anyway. And so there was a sense that UK pop was second-rate compared to American pop. But the success of the Beatles encouraged other similar bands. And so these, maybe the most important of these are the Rolling Stones, the Dave Clark Five, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Billy J. Kramer, the Hollies, and the Animals. Interestingly here, groups like Jerry and the Pacemakers and Billy J. Kramer were also managed by Brian Epstein, and we'll talk next week about the Brian Epstein empire, which kind of compares with the Larry Parnes one of just a few years earlier. In 1963, the number of UK hitmakers on the UK charts was competitive with the number of US artists. Now, if you look at the charts, you'll see that actually in previous years there were as many UK artists as there were US artists, sometimes even more. But what they were doing as UK artists was very much in imitation or derivative of the American style. Now these new artists were seen as something markedly British, even though I'm making an argument that much of what they were doing structurally was very much indebted to American pop music. It was perceived as being something that was sort of grown on our own soil. And for the first time, these artists were now overtaking in number and hit records and this kind of thing, American artists. And this was an important morale builder, a confidence builder for these groups. It's hard to imagine today in rock music that anybody would think about British pop music as being second rate to American pop music, but this is the way it was. And it was this moment for people in the UK, the beat music boom led by the Beatles, which really sort of is the tipping point to give these UK artists a sense that they can be just as good. Of course, by 1964, the Beatles would have an even bigger impact on the US market and beyond and the world. But that, as I said before, is a story for next week. Let's just, before we close this particular video and move on to the album with the Beatles, take a look at the first 5 UK hits for the Beatles, occurring mostly across 1963. We have Love Me Do, which was backed with P.S. I Love You, went to number 17 in October of 1962, that being mostly a Paul song. Then that's followed with Please Please Me, backed with Ask Me Why, went to number 1 or number 2, depending on the chart you check, in January of 1963. The album going to number 1, Please Please Me, is mostly a John song. Then following on that, From Me to You with Thank You Girl, that was another number 1 hit in April of 1963. That one really, those really are sort of John and Paul sort of writing together. Again, From Me to You, as Paul has said so many times, they were basically writing the songs to the fans. Thank You Girl, From Me to You, this kind of thing. The next, the fourth in this sequence, She Loves You, from August of 1963. Again, number 1, that one backed by I'll Get You. Again, a song written jointly by John and Paul. And then I Want to Hold Your Hand, released in November of 1963 in the UK, backed with This Boy. An interesting song, This Boy, because it shows the Beatles sort of doing a doo-wop harmony singing thing that we maybe associate more with the Beach Boys in a certain sense than with the Beatles, but it shows that influence as well. I Want to Hold Your Hand, of course, would break in this country, or in the United States that is, in January of 1964 and be the first record to be released by Capitol Records in this country, along with the promotional campaign. But as I say, that's a story for next week. For now, let's move on to the Beatles' second album as released in the UK, With the Beatles.